Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. My name is Norman Goda, and when I'm not moving chairs, I am the director of the UF Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies. This is our kickoff event for the spring semester of 2024, and it's going to be a very good one. It is sponsored by the Alexander Grass Chair for Jewish Studies and the Isser and Ray Price Library of Judaica, and I'd like to thank Rebecca Jefferson, who's way out there directing traffic, for the use of the lovely Judaica suite. This is a one more thing. If you have a RAC card, and each one of you should have a RAC card from our center, thank you. Please flip it over. It'll show you how to join our social media stuff. We have an Instagram account. And also, it will show you how to get on our mailing list. We have a lot of wonderful events this semester, including our famous film festival, all films being free, and we have a wonderful event just this Monday with Deborah Dash Moore talking about Jewish photography in New York. So please sign up and please keep an eye out for events. But today's event is really kind of a celebration for a lot of us, because we are celebrating and listening to our colleague Yaniv Feller talk about his new book, The Jewish Imperial Imagination, Leo Baeck and German Jewish Thought. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Feller, and I would also like to introduce today's discussant, Martin Kavka. Yaniv Feller is a scholar of modern Jewish thought and also museum studies. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto. From 2015 to 2017, Dr. Feller worked as a curator of Jewish religion in the new permanent exhibition, or the permanent exhibition of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. From 2017 to 2022, he was the Jeremy Svelling Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Wesleyan University. And it was in 2021 that I met him here by chance at the home of a mutual friend. And I walked home thinking, wow, it would be great to have this guy here. And at the end of 2021, we had an opportunity to do that, and I'm proud to say that he is my colleague and a colleague within the Shorstein Center now. His articles have appeared in journals such as Comparative Studies in Society and History, Jewish Studies Quarterly, and the very prestigious New German Critique. Now, his first book, which I've already told you about, The Jewish Imperial Imagination, Leo Baeck and German Jewish Thought, won one of the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Awards from the Association of Jewish Studies. This is before it was even published, so you know that this is something that's worth hearing about. Now, Yaniv today is going to speak about his book with Dr. Martin Kavka, who I will also introduce. Dr. Kavka received his PhD from Rice University, and he is a professor in the Department of Religion at Florida State University. His research has been funded by the Center for the Study of Religion at Princeton, as well as the Katz Center of Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His first book is Jewish Messianism and the History of Philosophy, and that also came out with Cambridge University Press. And Dr. Kavka has also won the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in Philosophy and Jewish Thought from the Association for Jewish Studies. He is putting the finishing touches on a second book, The Perils of Covenant, which is about American Jewish thought after World War II. He also has 5 edited volumes to his credit, and I won't list them all, but I will mention one, the coedited Cambridge History of Jewish Philosophy, this one on the modern era. So I will get out of your way, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague Yaniv Feller and Dr. Martin Kavka.
So now that we're all clipped, I want to welcome everyone that's here. This is perhaps one of the largest crowds for a Jewish studies event in Florida I think I've ever seen. So I'm especially grateful to everyone who is here. I also want to welcome everyone who's watching online for this event. You know, we work perhaps at rival institutions, one might think. But as far as Jewish studies goes, there is no rivalry between UF and FSU, and it's a great privilege for me to be here in a way that has nothing to do with football.
Which is rare.
Yet, maybe later. And to participate in the glory of the publication of Professor Feller's book. So one of the things that I see my role as doing is really to make sure that those of you in the audience, whether here or online, really have a taste of why the book is so great, the contribution that it makes, and also to think through with us about some of the deep stakes of the book. And I think it's really interesting that we have this book on Leo Baeck. And Leo Baeck was someone who maybe 2 generations ago was perhaps at the foremost level of fame within modern Jewish thought. There was a very popular book about him written in the late 50s that described him as the heart of German Jewry. And then sort of over the time that I was in graduate school in the last part of the 20th century, and Baeck sort of receded into the distance. And so there have been a couple books recently published on Baeck. Professor Feller's book is one of them. But I think that the first thing I'd like to ask you to do, Yaniv, is to just sort of talk a little bit about Leo Baeck's biography and life, just for those people watching who might not know much about him, who might only know him by name or by reputation, or those people watching who might not know anything about him at all.
Okay, yeah, so that's it. Thank you for coming, and thank you for agreeing to kind of participate in this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you all for coming. Maybe one way to start it is just let's do a show of hand if you ever heard the name Leo Baeck. So that's very telling for us, right? Because this is a person that used to be really, as Martin, as you were saying, at the forefront. And Baeck himself once reflected upon it, and he said, as is well known, laurels have no nutritional value. And what he meant by that is that fame is empty calories, right? It's kind of, it doesn't mean anything. But I think fame can be telling. He was called the Pope of German Jewry, a saint in our times, a symbol of German Jewry. So people really saw him as embodying an entire tradition. And one good way of thinking about it is through named institutions. So if you look just at the sheer number of institutions that are named after Leo Baeck. So the Center for Jewish History has the Leo Baeck Institute, which is the main central archive of German Jewish history. There's a branch in New York, a branch in London, a branch in Jerusalem, and an affiliate in Berlin. There's a Leo Baeck Temple in Los Angeles. There's a Leo Baeck Day School in Haifa. There's also a Leo Baeck Temple, I think, in Buenos Aires. There's where the main institution of the German Jews, the Central Council of Jews in Germany, where they sit is called the Leo Baeck House. So that already tells you again kind of how important he is. But he's one of those people that obviously nowadays a lot of people haven't heard about, but even people who have heard about don't really know much. So it's kind of helpful to just give a very brief overview of his life. So he was born in 1873 in Lissa, or today's Leshno, and he came from a very long and distinguished family of rabbis. On his gravestone, it actually says, aus dem Stamme von Rabbiners, migeza Rabbanim, from the family, or from the lineage of rabbis. He starts at what we would call today the conservative movement in the Breslau Institute. Then he moves to Berlin, so to the more Reform movement. Like every rabbi at the time, he's what we call a doctor rabbiner. So alongside being a rabbi, you complete your PhD, which he did at the Berlin University. After the PhD, he receives an appointment in Oppeln, again in kind of East Prussia. There he meets his wife, Natalie. They are married until her death in the 1930s. They have one daughter, Ruth. I love how even when they go hiking, they are still in full suits. That's like a very German Jewish thing to do. And Baeck really rises to fame at the turn of the century, so 1899, 1900. There's this guy by the name of Adolf Harnack. Adolf Harnack is the most important church historian of the time. And he writes a book called The Essence of Christianity. And what does he do in order to describe the essence of Christianity? He tries to emphasize just how great Jesus was. How does he do that? He emphasizes how great Jesus was by showing how bad the Judaism of Jesus' time was, of the Pharisees. So this becomes a bestseller. It's immediately translated. It runs through multiple editions. And Baeck is one of the first Jewish thinkers. At the time, he's virtually unknown rabbi to actually write a response to it. First, he writes kind of a more critical essay, and then in 1905, he writes his first magnum opus, The Essence of Judaism, which is clearly a response to the essence of Christianity. Now, Baeck's star rises. He makes career moves to Düsseldorf, then to Berlin, where he teaches in the institute where he studied. And 1914, the First World War begins. Baeck is one of the first rabbis to enroll as what's called a Feldrabbiner, as an army chaplain. Now, the army chaplains were not equivalent to the Christian army chaplains. They were paid by the Jewish community, who actually had to finance even the buying of the uniform, but they are supported by the army. And Baeck decides to serve basically for almost the entire duration of the war, so for almost 4 years. After World War I, during the Weimar Republic, Baeck's star really rises. He's invited to meet all the major kind of Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals. And when the Nazis come to power in 1933, Baeck is the only acceptable candidate for an umbrella organization named as the Reich Representation of German Jews. So it's kind of an umbrella organization of the Zionists and the liberals and later the Veterans Association, so all sorts of the major Jewish organizations. And they're like, who can we find a figure we all agree can represent us and sort of will be fair? And they kind of land on Baeck as the only acceptable candidate. So this is him speaking at one of their events. Now, this organization goes through very difficult times, of course, as the Nazi persecution progresses. In 1935, the organization changes from Reich Representation of German Jews to Jews in Germany. Now, that sounds like a small linguistic change, right? But it's actually a very significant one, because now Jews can't call themselves German. They are like Jews in Germany. After the November pogrom of 1938, known as Kristallnacht, Baeck remains at the head of the organization when the organization changes its character and becomes a Gestapo-controlled organization. And this is the part where a lot of the biographers of Baeck struggle with. This is the part where he receives a lot of criticism. Hannah Arendt, the great political theorist, infamously called him in her report from the Eichmann trial. She called him in a combination of English and German, the Jewish Führer, which is, Führer is the same word they used for Hitler, right? It was so outrageous that afterwards, in subsequent editions, she left her criticism of Baeck, but she deleted this expression, because even she, I guess, knew she went too far. In 1944, Baeck is deported to Theresienstadt ghetto, where he survives the war. In the ghetto, he also takes primarily spiritual leadership roles. So he lectures, he visits the sick, he takes care of the elderly, and so on. He survives the war there, and after the war, his star really skyrockets. He really becomes a statesman without a state. So when he visits the US in 1948, for example, he is invited to meet the president in the White House. He's the first non-American rabbi to to open a congressional session with a prayer. So really gets honorary degrees, meets mayors. He's on very friendly terms, if we leave the United States for a moment, with Theodor Heuss, which was the president of West Germany. And in 1956, he dies in London. So after the war, he does not return to Germany. He decides to leave for London. And one way of thinking about it, maybe he just couldn't bring himself to return to Germany, even though he does visit the country afterwards. Another is, of course, a very pragmatic reason. At that point, he's a very old man, and that's where his only daughter lives. So he goes to London and he spends the rest of his life there. So I hope this kind of very brief biography helps you get a sense of the person, and now we can start talking about the thought itself.
So thanks for that. That was great, and it says something about the magnetism that he had after he died, and that led to these organizations to be named after him. And when I think about the way that I was trained, right, I'm a probably more older than you than I'd like to admit. But when I think about the way that I was trained, so much of scholarship in modern Jewish thought was about this kind of charisma that certain thinkers had. And then we began to move into a kind of way in which we would talk about how arguments that these thinkers made, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, and we'd fight at various conferences about who was the better thinker, who was the more charismatic thinker. And one of the things that your book is doing that I love so much is that it shows us new questions we should be asking. Like we're not necessarily asking, who is the coolest of all of the Jewish thinkers? But for you, these thinkers aren't just brains, they're not just coolness indexes as if it were Us Weekly or People Magazine or something like that. For you, thinkers are deeply situated people, and their situations matter, and they impact the questions that they ask. Now, for you in this book, all of this is part and parcel behind your turn to this phrase, the imperial imagination, which is how you want to understand the entirety of Baeck's career from beginning to end. So can you say more about what the imperial imagination is for you and how that opens up Baeck's writings and how that helps us read him better or more precisely?
Sure, I will say though that on the question of coolness. So apparently when he was a younger rabbi, he was considered very uncool. So we have accounts of, people in his synagogue that are like, his sermons are so boring because they are up there and we can't really understand him. Interestingly enough, it changes by the time he's older. So in Theresienstadt, in the ghetto, there are many, many public lectures, and there Philip Mannes, who organized many of them, writes that Baeck kind of completely changed. I remember him as this boring lecturer during the time in Berlin, but now he's a sage at the height of his power, kind of communicating. And when Mannes when Mannes does his 500 event, which is a very big deal, in the ghetto, right? The 500 public cultural event, the speaker he chooses is Leo Baeck, precisely because of that. Now, in terms of Baeck's arguments, it's true that he is not as necessarily attractive to some as, say, other names you might have heard, Martin Buber or Franz Rosenzweig. But I think when we think about how and why we study German Jewish thought, he has one big advantage. People actually read him. People actually read him in his time, right? The Essence of Judaism was meant as a popular book. And of course, if you have a popular book, then people are influenced by it. It didn't have the privilege of staying in the ivory tower. So now to the organizing concept, which is the Jewish Imperial Imagination. So maybe a helpful way, it is a theoretical concept, so bear with me. One way of thinking about it is to break each of those terms. So let's begin with imagination. So imagination is something we do, right? It's sometimes referred to as a human faculty or a faculty of the mind. So think about dragons or unicorns, if you prefer, right? It's this category that we all know they don't really exist in the world, right? Despite what we are seeing in movies. Yet at the same time, they are something we can imagine. So imagination is something that is a human faculty that takes objects from reality and makes something new. Now, the fact that this something is new and is not real, scare quotes, doesn't mean it can't have a real influence in the world. So imagination, the way I read it, following all sorts of political theorists, is a political collective concept. We have what we call a political imagination, right? We think about what it means to be American, right? Or the American dream would be one of those visions we can share and that we create now as something that works with reality, but also beyond it. Imagination can have two contrasting political forces. On the one hand, it can be conservative, right? Conservative not necessarily in the reactionary way, but it can be a stabilizing, this is how we do things, because this is how we imagine the world to be. On the other hand, because it's this idea of opening, of imagining new horizons, new possibilities, it also has the potential to be radical, that is to use the current images and create something completely new. So far for imagination. Imperial, I understand in kind of a very straightforward way. Empires or imperial projects are projects of expansion by way of conquest or annexation or economic control, and they are often done by a metropole, by a central power that is sending people to another place. Often colonialism, if you follow definitions, say, of Jorgen Osterhammel, it's a minority using a majority culture in another place, say for cheap labor, for resources. So this would be the imperial. So imperial imagination is ideas and images of empire that can be used to think about imperial projects, to propagate, to continue imperial projects. They can also be used the other way around, to fight empire, to contrast the leading discourse. And the Jewish, of course, is the last part of it. So what I am interested in is what was the relation between the prevalent or the majority of what Germans thought about their empire, and Germans thought in imperial terms throughout the period Baeck lived. It was called, so when he lived, it was a period, the unified Germany was called the Kaiserreich, right? So it had a Kaiser and it was a Reich. So it had an emperor and it was an empire. It was the, I think, third in largest in terms of population, the fifth in terms of area or land. So it's really a major empire, and my argument is, of course, if you grow up under these conditions, you might be influenced by them. So what I'm interested in is the way Jews both worked with those terms, but also worked against those terms. And what I'm trying to achieve, I guess, with this concept is usually when you talk about Jews and empire or Jews and colonialism, we see it a lot today, right? You have a very dichotomous narrative. It's either, oh, they are imperialist and they are bad and it's all like unacceptable, or you have a strong strand in Jewish scholarship that tries to show the anti-imperial, sometimes people call it counter-history, how Jews worked with stereotypes about Jews and tried to subvert them. And I'm trying to say, listen, human beings, yes, even our great thinkers, are complex, and sometimes they might ascribe to stuff that they don't even recognize, and sometimes they might use it very consciously in order to contradict it. So both the Jewish and the imperial, I don't take as a given. I think the imperial fantasies in Germany helped determine how Baeck thought about Judaism, and I think his Judaism and his place as a Jew, as part of the minority in Germany, helped him think critically about the German imperial project. So this is the tension I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me because it taps into sort of a a classic way of thinking about Jews in America also, or Jews in the West in general, where the Jewish minority is both a part of a larger culture but also exists apart from it. And those tensions of being alongside but also a little against that's beautifully done in the book. I wonder whether I could ask you to say more about just one example of this sort of push and pull kind of thing. So when I was reading the book, I gasped with joy many times. I gasp with joy when I read. I'm that kind of boy. But early on it was because you basically say that we cannot understand any sort of argument in Europe about Jews as a missionizing people, right? As a light to the nations, as we read in that very common translation of a verse from Isaiah, without thinking about empires, right? I mean, to missionize for you doesn't make any sense without thinking about some sort of context in which empires also do that, right? The metropole sends people out. So can you say something more about just how those relate for you? I mean, is it the case that theology, do we always have to read these theological things behind in the light of that context? Does it mean something new with Baeck that it didn't before? I think that's something that I'm trying to ask here about the push and pull here.
So maybe a good place to think, that's a great question, maybe a good place to think about it is through this concept of prophetic ethics, right? So many of us who went to Jewish day schools or who read Jewish philosophy, there is this narrative of there's a Jewish ethics, sometimes we call it tikkun olam nowadays, right? And it's about the Jews. It draws its sources on the prophets, right? So on the idea that the prophets teach us good morality and that the Jewish task is to spread this morality. This is kind of a common narrative. Sometimes it's called the Jewish contribution to the world. Sometimes it's called ethical monotheism, right? This belief in one God as promoting a certain ethical behavior in the world. Now, Baeck is interesting in this regard because he seems to work on two lanes at different times. So in Theresienstadt, for example, in the only surviving lecture we have, he very clearly posits the prophets as opposed to the entire Western tradition. So he thinks there's an entire Western tradition of writing historiography from Thucydides all the way to Karl Marx and onward. That is wrong, that is pessimistic, that is just it's a sad tradition, it's pessimistic, it's very negative because it thinks that it's concerned with power. And if you look at history, empires rise and fall, right? That's how history works. And for Baeck, prophetic history is a different mode. It's a different mode because it sees that the collapse of empires is potentially a good thing, because it promotes the ethical monotheism. So that's where Baeck is very close to, let's say, the classical narrative of the prophets in Jewish thought and how we like to use them. Then there are really weird moments in Leo Baeck. And some of the really weird moments in Leo Baeck, and the moment that kind of really turned me into thinking about empire, is the part where I try to figure out what does Baeck means in the essence of Judaism when he says that the entire, that part of the essence of Judaism was that it tried to convert the world, die Welt zu bekehren. And I was like, wait, what does it mean to convert the world? Does it just mean to make the world a better place? And then I found more and more evidence. No, Baeck literally means conversion. He thought in 1905 and in 1912 and after the Holocaust, he believed that Jews, just like Christians, just like Buddhists, just like Muslims, should have active missionary activity. Now that's something that stands in a lot of contrast with what we hear in Jewish philosophy. So I try to make sense, okay, how come he even imagines it? Yeah. And I think the sources of this imagination are precisely the combination of this Jewish idea of light to the nations, but with the idea of empires expanding, right? We are sending, even writes about it in terms of we will send outposts, right? So the entire terminology, we would send outposts and outreach. After the Holocaust, he believed that the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Union College, two very kind of important rabbinical seminaries in the United States, are the places. He was like, they should have whatever, MA in missionary studies, and they should train missionaries to go out to the world. And he says it would be a beautiful dissemination. Now, in my opinion, that's not a position that's very common in German Jewish thought. He's not the only one, but that's not a very common position. And I think the only way to explain it is to think about all the empires sending missionaries, or all the Christian missionaries. So in this sense, they are connected. Now, are they always connected? I don't know. Because I work in intellectual history, I would insist on looking at a particular thinker.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that makes me think is that even though, you know, we don't necessarily hear people talk about a kind of program of missionizing within Judaism, or at least not a broad one. We have Chabad rabbis who want to bring lapsed Jews back into the ritual fold, and they missionize to them, but that's about it in the Jewish world that we know in the US now. But still, when I think about people who are members of Jewish communities now, they take pride in the wisdom of their tradition. They want to say that Judaism has some kind of moral truth that others should learn about. Is that implicitly imperial for you, or is that sort of tapping into that history in a way that those people might not know about?
So, yes and no. I think it's not necessarily imperial, of course, right? Because the question is, how are you imagining the actions of taking pride in it? For Baeck, the missionizing was inherently connected to Jewish pride. He said in 1912 in a private letter, he said, oh, you know what, if we gain missionaries, it would increase the pride in Judaism also for Jews. Because what can be more compelling for me to think about my own community if I see that other people want to join it? So in this sense, it's connected. But of course, most Jewish communities nowadays don't hold this position. The head of the Hebrew Union College in the 50s, I believe, still held to a similar position. But most Jewish communities nowadays don't. We have some organizations, Bechol Lashon, which is based, I think, in San Francisco or somewhere on the West Coast, is kind of really trying to help communities who self-identify as Jewish. They are trying to help them formally convert. But Baeck definitely thought that Judaism has a moral contribution to the world. And this moral contribution, if we have to sum it up, is not just bringing the idea of God, it's a twofold contribution. First, Judaism, or Jews, are the yardstick of morality, which again, we can think about relevance for today. Basically, the argument is, tell me how the world treats the Jews, and I will tell you the level of morality in the world. And the second is they are harbingers, or they are pioneers of morality. So they should live what they preach, but they should also preach it. So in this sense, for example, if we think about this idea of the election of Israel, right? For Baeck, the election doesn't mean you get away with stuff. The election means you should hold yourself to a very high ethical and moral standard.
So if Jews are to speak in the world to hold non-Jews up to an ethical and moral standard, whether they end up converting to Judaism or not, one of the things that means in Christian Europe, or a Europe in which Christians are by far the majority, is that Christians are screwing things up in some way, right? I mean, Jews are the harbinger of some sort of ethical future because the Christians are falling short of the task. So, Baeck, what is it that Christians are doing wrong for Baeck?
where do we begin? In Baeck's opinion, and again, we need to remember this is a time where religion mattered a lot, right? When people, many Christians were Christians. They had some affiliation with it. They had thoughts about it, and the same goes for Jews. So it's not, in this sense, it's perhaps more than today, although I don't think there's empirical hard data. Baeck was highly, highly critical of Christianity. In perhaps his most famous essay in the 1920s, it's called Romantic Religion. And in this essay, he makes kind of an ideal type distinction between Christianity and Judaism. Judaism is what he calls a classical religion. He never really develops it further. The idea was to write two articles, Romantic Religion and Classical Religion. He never really writes the part on classical religion. I suspect personally it's because the essence of Judaism, his earlier work about Jewish ethics, is this classical religion, so he doesn't really have much to add. Basically, this is everything we discussed. It's ethics, it's being ethical in the world, it's believing one God, etc. Romantic religion for Baeck is something that has no foundation in morality. And it has no foundation in morality because it has loosened or completely detached its faith in the one God. So put differently, Baeck thinks everything that's ethically valid about Christianity is Jewish. And everything, when Christianity goes astray, that's where it becomes lawless. And when it becomes lawless, it becomes immoral. And for him, if you want to kind of do an overarching sketch of history, for him, it starts with Saint Paul, right? The Apostle Paul, who for him combined the Jewish elements, because Paul was Jewish initially, with Roman mystery cults. And this already introduces a foreign element for him. And later, in his opinion, some Christians tried to move further and further from this relation to the Old Testament and to Judaism. So one famous example that is implicit in his argument is the 2nd century arch-heretic Marcion. It's the first kind of Christian who offered the canon of the New Testament. And his canon was basically, we just need the Gospel of Luke and some epistles of Paul. And we definitely don't need the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is of an evil God in this world. And the Redeemer God is a completely different God. So this is an extreme version, but Baeck actually finds it in other places in Christianity. He finds it in Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism. He finds it ostensibly in Adolf Harnack, his opponent in those debates. And I should say, it sounds kind of crazy that people still debate it, right? But even in the first decade or the second decade of the 21st century, there was a very prominent Protestant theologian by the name of Notger Slenska in Germany, the chair of systematic theology, which means he trains hundreds of students probably every semester, who wrote an essay suggesting to decanonize the Old Testament. He's like, the Old Testament doesn't speak to us as Protestants as much, and we need to kind of shove it aside. So it's still very much, it sounds archaic, but it's still very much a living debate.
Yeah. And it gets at this core of the role that ethical action plays in a religious belief, as opposed to, let's say, just believing certain things or saying a creed, something like that. I wonder whether I might shift a little bit. One of the things that I find so lovely about the book is that you're an incredibly careful writer. It's not that you're hesitant about making conclusions, but the conclusions that you make are really complex. And Baeck is someone who's really hard to write about fairly, as you hinted in your opening presentation of his biography. And this is especially true of his work during the Second World War. So I'm wondering whether you could just talk about your experience just going through that time period when Baeck is the leader of the organization of Jews in Germany that is run by the Gestapo. that is really overseen by the Gestapo, that kind of positionality that Baeck had that led to Arendt sort of dismissing him. What's it like to go through those texts? How are you sifting the evidence? How do you reach those kinds of conclusions that are both nuanced and fair?
So, yeah, about half the book is dedicated. So out of the 6 core chapters, about 3 of them are dedicated to the period between 33 and 45. And I admit it took me years to come kind of clear about it. Maybe it was also emotional maturity. So for the dissertation, I didn't have any of it.
Really?
I stopped in 1933 because I needed to graduate in order not to go, in order to finish in 5 years and be on my way, but I also just didn't know what to do with it. Yeah. I didn't know how to sift through those materials. And I don't know how, my colleagues, Natalia Alexin and Norman Goda, who are Holocaust historians, I don't know how they sleep at night, because when I read those materials, I find it really, really difficult, sometimes also just emotionally thinking about them. Then there was the methodological issues, right, or how to think about what materials we have. And that maybe I can divide into 2 different aspects. For the period of the Reichsvereinigung, when it's already kind of controlled by the Nazis, we have a manuscript with the catchy title, bear with me, this is the title, on the development of the legal position of the Jews in Europe, primarily in Germany, from antiquity until enlightenment. Catchy title, told you. And this work is a work that really puzzled scholars for many, many years, because Baeck mentions it near the end of his life. And he implies in an interview that it was a work that the German resistance commissioned, which raised a bunch of questions. Why would the German resistance need this type of document? If they needed it, why should they ask Baeck, who is probably there's surveillance on him by the Nazi administration, given his position? So there were a lot of open questions, let's say, but scholars, generally speaking, and that touches upon your question, they didn't really question it as significantly because it's Leo Baeck. He couldn't have been wrong about it. And if it's not for the resistance, what is this document? So in 2001, I believe, Hermann Simon, who ran the archive of the Centrum Judaicum, of the Jewish community in Berlin, he exposed documents that apparently knew for years that showed that this work was probably commissioned by the Gestapo. And that kind of that solves some of the questions, and it creates other questions. Mm-hmm. So many people just were like, oh, the matter is inconclusive until we can decide. That's kind of what contemporary scholars tend to say. And for me, the way I tried to approach it was to say, well, based on the existing evidence and kind of trying to parse out the logic, it's much more logical to assume that it was written for the Nazi administration. But the fact that something isn't a work for the resistance doesn't mean it has moments of resistance in the work. Mm-hmm. So then I tried to actually read this manuscript. It's 5 volumes, 1,200 pages, which he wrote in less than a year with the help of Leopold Lucas, who was a rabbi and scholar, and Hilde Ottenheimer. And what I found is that there are moments, there are signs in the manuscript that clearly allude to the fact that it was written probably for a Nazi audience. For example, Jewish authors are marked with a J for Jude, for Jew, which was a customary practice at the time. For example, the sources Baeck and his co-authors cite, which is a Forschungen zur Judenfrage, which is a journal of one of the most anti-Semitic research institutes in Germany, founded in the late 30s. So these kind of cue you in this direction. But what I try to do is I try to read this work and say, okay, what does that tell us about Baeck? And I think one helpful way of thinking about it is through the notion of intellectual forced labor. So it's not like they had much choice in terms of writing it. And we have parallels. The Jewish Museum in Prague is a parallel. The scholars in Vilna who needed to produce academic works about the Karaites for the Nazis are a parallel. So we know this thing existed. And if we read it this way, again, we are not trying to say, oh, he was this brave resistor, but we are also not trying to say, oh, this is completely a work of collaboration. So again, I try to avoid these very black and white, oversimplistic accounts.
Given the time, let me combine these last two questions into one, and I might do so in a little bit of an unwieldy way, but I'll try to be as clear as I can. Near the end of the book, you're writing about Baeck after the war's over, and in some ways, he's the same Baeck that he's always been, talking about ethical monotheism, talking about the mission of the Jewish people as spreading ethics throughout the world. But now he's also talking about Zionism. And Zionism and ethical monotheism are not categories that have always mixed so well. So that I'd like to hear you untangle a little bit. But also I want to ask that from this moment that we're in now. So you wrote this book before Hamas's terrorist attacks of last October, but we're now in a moment when people will describe Jews as imperialist or anti-imperialist, as settler colonialist or anti-colonialist. And now we have this book with imperial in the title. And so I wonder whether you think that Baeck has anything to say to this moment when this vocabulary is being used in Tallahassee. It's outside the student union on occasion or in various op-eds. You know, does what Baeck said about Zionism have anything to say to debates about Zionism now for you?
That's a big one. Let me try and unpack it. So one way to think about it is through Baeck's relation to Zionism. And it actually starts earlier, and I kind of dot it throughout the manuscript, but it's true that the real change is during the Nazi period and then after the war. So for example, when there's the call for the first Zionist Congress, right, of 1897, I believe first was supposed to be in Munich, but then Munich didn't want it, right? So there were protests, so it moved to Basel. So there's a rabbinical assembly. And again, 1897, Baeck is fresh out of his rabbinical ordination, is not a very known rabbi. And there are, I believe, so this rabbinical assembly calls to condemn Zionism. We need to remember, at the time when Zionism emerged, there was a very strong Jewish opposition to it. By the time Herzl died in 1904, probably less than 1% of the Jews in the world belonged to the Zionist organization. And they had good reasons in their eyes at the time, right? They were afraid of being accused of dual loyalty. They didn't want to go to this desolate place and dry swamps. They were happy in their coffee shops in Vienna. But Baeck so the rabbi is called to condemn Zionism. And Baeck is one of only 3 rabbis who votes against it. So he refuses to condemn Zionism. And again, we can think, young, unknown rabbi, that's a potential, probably voting, unlike his father, who was also a rabbi, so there's a tension going on there. So because he thought that Zionism is one form of Jewish renewal already then. He later, during the Weimar Republic and during World War I, he writes for Zionist publications. He gives lecture for Keren HaYesod. So he has this type of moments. Obviously, when he leads German Jewry, his main concern is immigration. And then Palestine, of course, is a destination. After the war, Baeck seemed to think that, or he might have thought it earlier, but he gives it a written expression later. So he thinks his overarching, he writes this work called This People, Jewish Existence. And the first volume is being published during his lifetime, the second is already after his death, posthumously. And he writes an overarching view of Jewish history. And he believes that Jewish history, sometimes we think of Jewish history as a center and diaspora, right? There's the diaspora Jews and there's Israel. There's one focal point. I know I have engineering students here and natural sciences, so maybe a geometrical form would be helpful. It's not a circle in his opinion, so it doesn't have one center. It's an ellipse. And what characterizes an ellipse is that it has two centers. So in the past, it was the Jews of the land of Israel and the Jews of Babylonia, and then it was Sepharad and Ashkenaz, and so on. And he thinks in the modern period, it's the United States and Palestine and then the state of Israel. But it's very clear that one needs the other. And in his opinion, the United States, or the Jews of the United States, stand for this universal ethical mission because they are the minority. And they need to support the state of Israel both financially, but they also need to hold it accountable, in his opinion. He thinks that without the Jews of the United States, Israel might become this nationalistic, narrow-minded place. That's his description. And he thinks it's the other way around. The Jews of the United States without the Jews of Israel would kind of get lost, would lose their particularity. They need to be reminded of kind of a national existence. So this is the tension that Baeck kind of describes, and he's not afraid to be critical of the state of Israel. So in 1948, he writes an op-ed in the New York Times with Albert Einstein, in which they decry the Jewish violence in Palestine. And they are saying it, we are afraid for the Jews. Now, what was his vision for the area? He never really puts it, as a political program, because he's not that type of thinker. But if you read his letters, if you read the references he makes in this opinion piece with Einstein, he seemed to have thought of some kind of a federation or a binational state. Now, of course, it's very easy to dismiss it as very, very naive nowadays, but this was his vision, and he wasn't alone. A lot of those German Jews, Austrian Jews, were part of this Brit Shalom or Ichud or all these organizations, but they were already then a tiny minority. Maybe one last thing is that I should also say that at the same time that he wasn't afraid to be critical of Israel, both on the pages of the New York Times and in comments, he wrote a sort of a responsa, a rabbinical letter, in which he decried the Orthodox hold on the religious establishments in Israel. So although he wasn't afraid to do that, he also never doubted the right of Israel to exist, because he was kind of this generation. Yeah. But interestingly enough, one of the arguments he uses for it is what we can call the John Locke argument, meaning here is a land and the Jews are helping to improve this land, and hence this stakes a claim, which is of course a part and parcel of colonial discourse. Yeah. So while he would reject, any calls for that challenge Israel's right to exist, he might be able to critique Israel. Because one of his major distinctions is between what he calls Macht and Kraft. These are two central concepts that I identify, or power and energy. And he thinks what empires do, and that kind of will bring us a full circle to the Jewish Imperial Imagination, what empires do is violent. it's coercive, it's violent. That's what empires do. He believed that's what the church did when it oppressed or limited legal rights. So he tries to reject Macht in favor of a different type, a more optimistic type of expansion, which he calls energy or spiritual energy. This idea of missionizing, of showing by living and by convincing this moral thing. So how relevant is that to the contemporary situation? I do not know. What I take some comfort in is that he always defined, and that's already in the essence of Judaism, so already in 1905, he called Judaism a religion of optimism. And when he makes this oversweeping historical account, the last era in Jewish history, he calls the Great Hope. So maybe there is some hope. Thank you.
Okay. We have a few minutes for questions from here. You in the back, and I will repeat what you say for the people who are watching online.
Tolstoy published, Gutman says he can't hear you. Turn the mic up.
Oh.
Of course, he wasn't Jewish. He was from his time in Russia.
Thanks.
And the statements were very famous. What he published sounds very, very much about what this gentleman's saying feelings when he published. I'm wondering possibly if one influenced the other. I don't know the timeline on birth, but he almost his feelings on the Jews and the role of the Jews in the world very, very much copies this gentleman's feelings. I wonder if when you did your research, did you come upon anything that Tolstoy said that you thought was similar?
So this is a question about Leo Tolstoy's view of the Jews in his letters as also having this kind of emphasis on mission, or Sendung would be the German word, or something like this. And I think one of the ways to reframe the question, or to make sure that I get the stakes of it out, is how widespread was Leo Baeck's view of Jews among non-Jews? To what extent are there Christians who are on Baeck's side against Harnack, for example? Something like that.
Okay, so there are a couple, thank you, yeah, that's an interesting question. There are a couple of ways of parsing it. First, we should say this idea of the role of the Jews in the world is also a very Christian idea. So already St. Augustine, right, sees a place for the Jews as witnesses, right? They should stay until the coming of Christ. And in fact, I would argue that this idea of the Jews as yardstick for morality, the Jews as tell me how they treat the Jews and I'll tell you how moral the world is almost an inversion of St. Augustine. So there is definitely also Christian views on it. Historically, Tolstoy doesn't play a role for Baeck. The Russians did play a role for certain German Jews, not for Baeck. Instead, in fact, especially after the Russian Revolution of 1917, he was highly, highly critical of Bolshevism, as it was called at the time. And after the war, when he thinks about the new imperial constellation, right, because suddenly it's the United States and the Soviet Union, his choice is very, very clear. For him, the Soviet Union is atheist, and hence it's godless, and hence it's immoral, right? Because morality is founded in the faith in one God, in his opinion. The United States, on the other hand, for him, is the place. This is the place that could save the world. He described the United States at one point as Atlas having the weight of the world on its shoulders. So his views on the Russians in this sense are probably also impacted by that, but I didn't find any connection. And to how much Christians knew Baeck, nowadays as well, Christians, there are Christians who find Baeck interesting. There's the theologian Panevich, who was influenced by Baeck, and there are Christians who are interested in Baeck on the one hand because they can see Christianity through his eyes, through this critique, and think about Christians' practices better. but also because, interestingly enough, after the Holocaust, Baeck believed there's a time for Jewish-Christian dialogue. It's like after everything that happened, now is the time for a dialogue. So that's something that Christians in the post-war era find appealing. Thank you.
One last question, especially from a brave undergraduate student. Rumor has it that if you ask a question at a talk, you have entry in the world to come.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So there's the academic answer and there's the mundane answer. The mundane answer is that I was an exchange student in Berlin, and we went, and at the time I already knew I would want to work on German Jewish philosophy, and we walked to the Leo Baeck house. It was a cool class. It was called the Jewish Berlin, and every week we traveled to another Jewish site. And we went to the Leo Baeck house, and I was like, oh, I heard the name Leo Baeck, but I never read him. And then I started reading him, and I found a very big difference between what I knew about him, this reform, liberal rabbi, and what his texts actually say. So that kind of, by the time I arrived to Toronto to do my PhD, I completely revamped my project and decided to write on Leo Baeck. So sometimes it's just those chance encounters that lead you to it. So thank you.
All right. Thank me. Join me. Don't
But
thank
also
me.
thank me.
No, don't thank me. Join me in thanking Professor Feller for his remarks today, for his excellent, excellent book.